For the sake of illustration, it will help to consider a test case from the Old Testament in which a civil law was applied to a historical situation. So consider the case of Zelophehad's daughters, who are mentioned in Numbers chapter 27. According to the law that God had given earlier regarding the distribution of the promised land, allotments were to be distributed to families, and they were to be divided among the sons. Now Zelophehad was a man who had died in the wilderness, leaving 5 daughters but no sons. According to the law of property distribution that God had commanded, Zelophehad's daughters could not inherit their father's land. So the daughters appealed to Moses. We read their petition in Numbers chapter 27, verses 3 through 4. Our father died in the desert and left no sons. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's relatives. Now, if the Lord had intended the law to be applied woodenly or mechanically, the case would have been clear-cut. As the law stood, Zelophehad's daughters could not receive an inheritance in the promised land. But in the next verse, a very remarkable thing happened. Listen to the words of Numbers chapter 27, verse 5. So Moses brought their case before the Lord. Isn't that amazing? Moses had delivered the law about property distribution and was the supreme judge in Israel. Above all others in that nation, he had intimate knowledge of the ways of God and of the details of God's law. If anyone should have known how to judge this case, Moses was the man. So why didn't he know what decision to render? Moses understood that the law God had given him was designed to manage a situation where there were sons. And he knew that the goal of this law was to secure each family's place within its tribe and to preserve their allotments of tribal lands. But in the case of Zelophehad's daughters, Moses faced the issue of how to apply the standard revealed by this law to a new situation. He needed help from God because he knew that the new situation would affect how he was to apply the law. And God's response is noteworthy. Listen to what God said in Numbers chapter 27, verses 7 and 8. What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. Say to the Israelites, if a man dies and leaves no son, turn his inheritance over to his daughter. The passage goes on to list a number of other instances in which a man's inheritance might fall to people other than his sons. But the point we are making is this: God indicated that the same aspect of his character was to be applied in different ways in different situations. In many respects, Christians face the same difficulty Moses faced. We have the standard of God's law, but we need to apply it to a new situation. The entire law must be reinterpreted and applied in the light of Christ and his work. As priest, Christ fulfills the ceremonial aspects of the law. The ceremonial principles of the law are still binding, and we are to follow them by trusting Christ as our sacrifice, and by worshiping in spirit and in truth. As king, Christ fulfills the civil aspects of the law, and the church, which is his nation on the earth, is bound to obey these aspects not only by living rightly under our respective earthly governments, which are under Christ's greater lordship, but also by directly honoring Christ as king and by keeping his commandments. And finally, as prophet, Christ fulfills the moral aspects of the law. We depend on Christ's morality alone as the basis for our acceptance before God. Yet we must also conform ourselves to Christ's image and example, seeking to live as morally as he did during his earthly ministry and as he continues to do in heaven. In summary, the categories of moral, ceremonial, and civil law are helpful in many ways, especially when we think of them as aspects of each law rather than as distinct categories. But these categories should never be used as the basis for ignoring any portion or aspect of God's laws. As we have seen, all of God's law remains our standard for morality, and we are obligated to apply all of God's law to our modern situation. Every bit of God's law still serves as our norm for Christian ethics. Now that we have established a basic orientation toward the variety of Scripture and God's law in Scripture, we should explore the unity of Scripture, considering the ways in which the law relates to other portions of God's written revelation.